All right, welcome everybody. As Julie said, this 4-week course is called What is God? Perspectives in the 20th Century, from the 20th century. We're looking at a different thinker each week, and each thinker will present a unique approach to thinking about and defining God. One of the things that's in the back of my mind, and I hope will be in yours too, as we do that though, is to think about what these 20th century thinkers have in common. And while they each present their own theology, and that's what we're going to look at, part of what we'll see is similarities and approaches between the different thinkers, because I do think there's unique views of God and theology in the 20th century, and that's something that will come out as well. Last week we looked at Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. This week is Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. Kaplan and Heschel spent much of their careers both working at the Jewish Theological Seminary with offices down the hall from each other. Students studied with both of them, and they were very, very different in their thinking, but had a good collegiality between them. Although students tended to gravitate towards one or the other in terms of where they fit within the Jewish span of thinking during that time. Kaplan was born in Lithuania and moved as a young child to America, and he spent more than 50 years teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and his influence is not just upon the conservative Judaism of which JTS is a part, but his students went on to form the Reconstructionist movement, which is based on his ideas. He wasn't interested in, as he was writing, in establishing his own movement or a movement based on his ideas. He wanted to influence Judaism, especially Judaism in America. But towards the end of his career, he followed his students and became more officially part of the Reconstructionist movement, which to this day still roots itself in his writings. But I would say, especially in America, in the non-Orthodox world, Kaplan's ideas are very rooted, and he had a lot of influence over how people think about God and Judaism, and we'll see a little bit about that as we read some selections of his today. You might know Kaplan for other things as well. Kaplan's daughter is famous. Kaplan's daughter was the first bat mitzvah in recorded human history at the beginning of the 20th century. I note that because people see him in some ways as a forerunner, of trying to push egalitarianism. I mention that in particular because you'll see today he uses a lot of male language in his writing. I didn't know Kaplan, so I don't know, it's hard for me to say where he would stand on things today, but I think the male language that's in his writing is reflective of the time in which he wrote, and I imagine that he would have used more gender-neutral writing. I resisted the urge to make all the text that we're going to look at today gender-neutral because I didn't want to presume that he would be okay with that. And thought instead I would give this comment that we're going to read it as he wrote it, and note that it is very male language in an age where we're very sensitive to that language. All right, and with that, I would love to jump in. We're going to do similar to last week. We're going to start with I'm going to give you a short reflective challenge to think for just 3 short minutes. Think to yourself, if you're somewhere where you have a pad of paper or a pencil or pen, or to even type some notes in the computer, but sometimes it helps to write down these thoughts. But I have a prompt question to get you thinking a little bit down Kaplan's path. I'll put out the prompt. We'll take 3 minutes for people to think. We'll hear a couple of responses, and that will be a lead-in to Kaplan's words themselves. So here we go, if you're ready. What I want to ask you to think about is a time in your life where you faced a particular obstacle or some sort of bump in the road that you needed to summon internally or externally, some extra strength to get through it. And I would love you to think about what obstacle did you face, and from where did you find the strength to help you push through it to a stronger place. So let's take 3 minutes. I'm watching the clock, and thank you, Julie, for putting it in the chat, and give you some silence to think, and then we'll continue. All right, about 30 seconds left. So if you're in the middle of a thought, try to wrap that up. And we're going to ask a few people to share briefly so we can hear some of what you wrote. If you feel free, if you feel comfortable sharing, great. If you want to keep your thoughts to yourself, that's fine too. But just hearing a few people's perspectives will help start the conversation and get us into I hope, a Kaplanian way of thinking.
So if you'd like to share your experience, you can either put it in the chat box or say that you'd like to be unmuted by letting us know in the chat box that you'd like to be unmuted, or finding the raise hand function in the participant box.
All right. Natalia sent a chat to me. So are you interested in sharing with everybody? If you are, let Julie know, or if there's someone else.
Okay, great. So Natalia, I'm unmuting you.
Great, thanks.
Is it working? Okay.
It is, we can hear you.
So I am looking to convert, but when I kind of told my family, we are definitely more Mexican Christian, and I was baptized. So when I started wrapping my hair, I received a lot of questions and prodding, and some of them were definitely well-intentioned, like they just wanted to know, but some just could not believe, like why would I want to change? Why would I want to convert? But God was through it all, so he never failed me.
Thank you for sharing. So the process of self-change or conversion can often be a time where you need to summon strength as people are responding to you. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. So one other person who wants to share?
Bruce?
So the time I lost my job, I was thinking about past experience and the fact that I got through the last time I lost my job. So having faith in the possibilities that even through difficult times, that there could be something good coming out of it in the end.
Thank you, Bruce, for sharing. At this time, we know there are lots of people who are finding that moment where they've lost a job and trying to find the strength to move through it. And thinking about future opportunities and future possibilities can help with that. And on a personal level, I wish you luck in the search, and especially in this the troubled times that we're in. Okay, so everyone has their, we've heard two voices and you have your own notes to think about. We're going to circle back to these ideas in a moment. I want to start out with some words from Kaplan. Oh, I see a hand raised from Wendy. We could take one more. Wendy, do you want to give a brief comment? Wendy Lebowski. Did you see that, Julie?
Yeah, Wendy, you're unmuted.
No? Are you there, Wendy? All right. So we're going to then, sorry, Wendy, maybe we'll circle back to you later.
I'm back.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Wendy? She was briefly back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say the experience that I had was when I was in a terrible situation where I was held up at gunpoint. And I summoned the courage to get through it by remaining calm and praying, and got everybody that was involved in the room at the same time involved in that, and we made it through, and nobody got hurt.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I have no personal experience with that to relate to, but I could imagine lots of fearful emotions coming in that moment, and you found internally a strength of through calmness and maybe helping others to find that place to help you through it. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to circle back to this notion in a moment. I want to start though with a brief statement by Kaplan about the task of defining God and belief in God in our era. The selections, I'm going to just introduce the text as I go to share my screen. The text that we're going to look at today all come from a book called The Future of the American Jew, which was published in 1967, written for the American audience, but about Judaism as a whole. My screen is up. I just want to confirm, Julie, can you see, is my screen sharing functioning okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So Kaplan starts, well, he doesn't start because this comes from page 182, but for us, he's going to start by defining a problem today about faith in God. And he says the following: the chief problem confronting the historic religions, Judaism is a part of that, nowadays is not how to lead people to believe in the cosmic power that sustains human life, whether we designate it God or by any other name. It is rather how we shall conceive God. And this is a frame for Kaplan that in his mind, the issue is not how to convince people how to believe in God, but the issue is how do we define God? And defining God in a way that fits who we are as modern people is an important task, and in part what Kaplan set out to do in his writing. I wanted to use that frame for us to jump in to his writings about how we experience God, which are the texts that are coming next. So like we did last time, I'm wondering if we can have a couple volunteers to read some of these paragraphs. We'll hear some voices and then we'll pause to talk about them afterwards. So I have 3 paragraphs about how we experience God. I'm wondering if we can have 3 different volunteers to read. And if you chat, Julie, or put in the chat that you'd be willing to read, then Julie can help note you and unmute you, and we'll hear Kaplan's words. So do we have a volunteer to read this first paragraph that I have under the heading, How We Experience God?
Not yet.
All right, I'm going to wait a second.
We have someone.
Excellent.
Joan.
Thank you, Joan.
How we experience God. The objective study of religion the world over has proved that beyond a doubt that the belief in God originated neither in speculative reasoning, nor in any supernatural revelation. Gods have to be believed in before they can be beheld, imagined, or proved to exist.
All right, thank you, Joan, for that. I want to know two things about this paragraph. The first is similar to Heschel, where we looked at last week. Kaplan says that that belief, that faith comes first, and we don't find God through logic and reasoning. Different from Heschel is Kaplan's rejection of supernatural revelation, where it could be different writings, but Kaplan has a different book that we're not going to look at today, but it's called Judaism Without Supernatural Revelation. Judaism Without Supernaturalism. And for Kaplan, Kaplan is clearly in a camp that does not believe that God is a supernatural power. And we will come back to that a little more as we proceed forward. All right, I'm scrolling to the next two paragraphs, a little more meat here in these two paragraphs. Do we have a volunteer to take on this next screen? All right, well, I don't want to use our time waiting, so I'll read the screen, follow along, and then I will turn my camera back on and we'll take questions and comments about what Kaplan's saying here. To find the root of men's belief in God, we have to note how man's will to live progresses from blind instinct to highly articulate purpose. In all living beings, that will to live manifests itself in various hungers or drives for sustenance, shelter, a mate, migration, etc. Man, however, possesses the mental capacities which enable him to be aware of ends and means, of whole and part, of self and not self. Thus, he has come to think in general and abstract terms. This heightened awareness augments his chances for life and brings to the fore of his consciousness his entire struggle for existence. By the same token, that man becomes aware of himself as a person engaged in a struggle against dangers and difficulties, he also becomes cognizant of the help of a power or powers to conquer obstacles. That awareness finds expression in ideas. What is most distinctive about himself as a person is termed soul, and what is most distinctive about the power or powers upon whom he depends is termed God. All right, I'm going to come back to you right now. Comments or questions about that? I already see some emerging in the text. Carrie says, how do you prove to exist the unprovable? I'm going to leave that open for a minute, Carrie, because we're going to circle back a little bit. We'll see that echo in Kaplan's words. But I do think both for Kaplan and Heschel, as we saw last week, proof is not the field that they're operating in. Coming to belief in God, coming to experience God does not emerge out of reasoning. It comes from other experiences. Thoughts, questions, and comments about the text we just looked at? We have a pensive group this week. That's all right. So Kaplan, right, I think if you were here last week, you saw that Heschel's writing was poetic. Heschel took, right, a scene, people often look at his theological writings and see the poetry in it. Kaplan seems to have more of a nonfiction style, an academic style, and he comes at it a little bit like an anthropologist or a psychologist. Right? Says, we people as a species have certain abilities that other creatures don't, that allows us to experience the world and think about it. We're able to not just act on instinct, but think about ends, goals, and means. And as we navigate the world, we know that we encounter obstacles, and as we face them and emerge through them, it's the power that helps us through it that is the phenomenon that he terms God. Right, I'm seeing an active chat. So I want to go to the questions that people are chatting in, try to deal with them all. Michael says it would seem that the power could be a community, based on what he writes. That's true, Michael. For Kaplan, and we'll see this in a little bit, there are individual encounters with this power or experiences of the power, and we define that. But in some ways, Kaplan looks at the world in terms of the different cultures, or the term he uses are civilizations, and it's often the community experience that shapes how we think about things. So you're onto something there, and we'll see that a little bit later in the text. Julie's forwarding a question from an anonymous source. How does Kaplan, or maybe it's Julie's, how does Kaplan explain the God of the Torah? So I want to also hold that. We're going to come back and think about the Jewish experience of it, as opposed to universal experience. So that's a great question to be asking at this point. Joanne says, so does God create man, or does man create God? That reminds me of Yehuda Amichai poem. That's for a different session. I think for Kaplan, like for Heschel, God is something that's part of the fabric of existence. And it's not an issue of who creates which, but that God is definitely a phenomenon that's part of the human experience. There's not a creator-creation relationship. So the metaphor of creator and created doesn't function that same way in Kaplan's thought. Joan says, Kaplan was also in the time of Dewey. Imagine you're thinking about John Dewey, the educational philosopher, as opposed to Dewey, the politician and once presidential candidate, right? Which may account for some of his perspective as well as Heschel's. It's interesting that you note that I took as a graduate student, I took a class about John Dewey and wrote papers about Dewey and Heschel. I don't know for sure that either Kaplan or Heschel were aware of Dewey or vice versa, but they were both 20th century thinkers, and there are echoes of John Dewey's educational philosophy in Kaplan. So thank you for all those chats. I appreciate that. Maureen's asking about the name of the Amichai poem that I'm thinking of. It's from his last book, Open, Closed, Open, in the chapter Prayers Change, Gods Remain the Same. The specific poem doesn't have a name because that chapter has numbered poems, and I don't recall offhand which number, but Yehuda Amichai, Open, Closed, Open. Anyways, people can feel free to also volunteer to speak if you tire of my voice. But let's go to here's the meat of what we're going to look at today. I want to go back to the text. Those first paragraphs we looked at are sort of a nice summary of how Kaplan sees the human experience. The next text I want to look at will be specifically Kaplan's definitions of God and religion that will help answer some of your questions and give us a little more to talk about. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. And as I'm going back to screen sharing, these paragraphs are easier to read. You can volunteer to Julie if you are reader, so we can hear somebody else's voice. All right, the screen sharing has started and the document is coming back up. All right, I have here definitions. I have a definition about the belief in God, and then I called it a note from a few pages later that these two sentences aren't necessarily connected for Kaplan, but I connected them to help explain what's here. Someone want to read these two sentences for us?
Anybody?
All right. Julie, do you mind taking a stab?
Joan's gonna do it.
Oh, thank you, Joan.
Belief in God is belief in the existence of a power conducive to salvation, which is the fulfillment of human destiny. Note, thinking of God as process rather than as an entity in no way tends to make him less real.
Okay, thank you, Joan. Two important things in this statement here, right? This first definitional statement, I hope echoes the quotes we looked at before. Belief in God is belief in the existence of a power conducive to salvation. Salvation is a key term for Kaplan, which means the fulfillment of human destiny. Kaplan looks at the human experience over time and sees our civilizations advancing. And part of what is one aspect of that is in each, as we advance, we become closer to fulfilling the most of who we can be and to most of fulfilling our human destiny. Kaplan, like many observers of the world, would see that, with advances also come new problems and other challenges. So he's not trying to take away from the fact that now in the 21st century, we're dealing with some problems that we've created for ourselves, but he does see progress over time in understanding who we are and what we can be. And God is the power, the force that helps us reach that stage of salvation and overcome the obstacles towards finding that salvation. And he notes, which is in the sentence here, that we're thinking of God as a process, as part of this process. In Kaplan's view, this doesn't make God any less real than the personal God described in the Bible or other places by other religions. All right, so let's look at the next definition here. Just to add to that, I'll read this in. So he says, religion, which follows from this definition of God, religion is thus man's conscious quest for salvation or the achievement of his human destiny. All right, so Kaplan sees religion as part of human civilization, and the purpose of religion is to help focus us on salvation, or in other words, religion helps us focus on achieving our human destiny. And what religion is meant to be is that part of our culture, of our civilization, of our being, of our existence as individuals and collective communal creatures. Religion is that which helps us aspire towards salvation and gives us the strength to move towards that achievement of our destiny, which is that salvation. Any volunteers to read the note that follows and the last paragraph that follows that? It might be your turn, Julie, if you don't mind.
We have Joanne.
All right. We've had Joan and Joanne. Great. Thanks, Joanne.
Yeah. Religion is thus man's conscious quest for salvation or the achievement of his human destiny. Note, humanity is not a monolith. Every religion is an aspect of a particular civilization. It is that aspect of a civilization which aims to render it worthwhile, both for the group as a whole and for each individual in it. Universal religion consists of conclusions concerning God and salvation, which are based upon the existence of mankind in general, and which addresses itself to all men without distinction. But Jewish religion is the interpretation of the experience of the Jewish people in the light of the universal conclusions and the application of these conclusions to present-day Jewish needs.
All right, thank you for that. So these, I'm coming back to you right now. So these texts help, they in part touch on some of the questions that people texted before that I read out. But it's Kaplan's statement that says, one recognizes that the human experience is not uniform, that different civilizations have had different experiences of the world and have different ways that they explain, understand that experience, and understand therefore what salvation is and what it looks like. Now, some aspects of religion are universal, and so we share them with members of other religions, and some are unique to our particular religion. So you could argue that faith traditions value human life. That's something that's universal. Something that within Judaism that says one way to help humans and human life reach the rights to advance to a place of health and stability and achieve salvation is through the practice, observance, the rituals of Shabbat, right? That part of what we need to reach salvation is to have a day where we take as a break. Now, Judaism isn't alone in having a Sabbath. Other religions have that too, but although it is, I think, in origin a Jewish concept. But not every religion necessarily has that notion of, right, the Sabbath as a way to taste salvation in this world. Other religions look at other things for that as well. I see some chats coming in. Could Kaplan be considered a Spinozan? Carrie, that's a great question. I need to think about that a little bit. That's a great thought. I think there's definitely some connections. I'd have to think more about Kaplan and Spinoza and how they might fit together. Maxine says, he uses the term salvation in a very peculiar manner, right? Salvation is human destiny, and that's not how Maxine says most people think of it, so I'm not sure what he's getting at. Thank you for that, right? Kaplan does try to use the Kaplan word for that, reconstruct religion and language. That's why, in part, why the movement that followed his thinking is called the Reconstructionist movement. Right, and some of that is the shift from a supernatural God to a non-supernatural God, right? Where, more in a pre-Kaplan way of thinking about religion, right? The source of salvation is God in many religions, right? God provides salvation for those who earn it, where people can earn salvation through living the right life, and then you get that reward in the next world, in the afterlife, or maybe even on this earth, but somehow provided by God, right? Salvation here is not the result of God's judgment or God's action, but salvation is an end that we are pursuing as a species and as a humanity as a whole, and each human civilization in its own unique way, based on its own unique experiences of the world and thoughts about how to overcome the obstacles that it faces. So you're right in that comment and noting Kaplan does use religious terminology in unique and different ways to posit how he thinks we should, going forward, think about religion and think about salvation. Thank you for that comment. Other thoughts or questions or comments about these snippets from Kaplan that we saw today? So Joan says, this relates to the comment before, had Reconstructionism existed, maybe, but only maybe Spinoza would have subscribed. Otherwise, he was probably the most famous Jewish secularist and was shunned from his community for it. That's definitely true. Spinoza in his time was writing about religion in a way that was not seen before within the Jewish community and potentially other religious communities. And Spinoza was a forerunner of new thinking about religion. It's hard to take him out of his context and put him in the 20th century, or take Kaplan out of his context and put him back with Spinoza. There are definitely some connections, although there are definitely differences, both in terms of time and context of their writing, but also in substance as well. And it is true to note that, right, Spinoza was excommunicated. Well, there were, I would say, there were groups that did excommunicate. Kaplan was excommunicated as well. The impact of, by some Jewish communities, the impact of that was not the same for Spinoza and his relationship with the Jewish community. But Kaplan definitely had his detractors within the Jewish community for rejecting certain norms. And this goes back to the question that someone posted about, what does Kaplan do with the Torah, right? So as someone who rejects supernaturalism, Kaplan is clearly in the camp to say that the Torah is a human product, not a divine product. Kaplan sees the Torah as the one stage of the Jewish people's development and one way that the Jewish people tried to codify how they saw the route to salvation. And the Jewish people recorded their thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and practices towards achieving salvation in that document that described the way in which they saw what salvation looked like in that time and that age. And that document can still be inspirational to us moving forward, especially if we, moving into the future, want to have continuity with the Jewish past. But Kaplan did not see the Torah as a divine document. He definitely saw it as a human document. I believe there happens to be a different day, a different time. There's another My Jewish Learning course going on that says, what is Torah? That's looking at, there's some overlap of the thinkers that we're looking at and they're looking at. Two different takes. If you're interested in that question, you might want to check that out as well. So you can see two organizing questions to look at different thinkers and thought, right? What is God? What is Torah? Two different ways to get into theology. So Bruce asks, how was Kaplan received in the conservative movement? That's a great question. So in the conservative movement, look, there's a way in which Kaplan's thought was unique and groundbreaking, and there were those that embraced it and those that resisted it. Kaplan did step on some core beliefs that were held by the Jewish people for many centuries. Especially, and including in the conservative movement, right? The conservative movement, which takes an academic approach to the study of Bible, was influenced and, through the course of the 20th century made a shift to look at all the evidence that there is that says that the Bible is a human document, not a divine document. Although Kaplan was very bold in the way he put it out and very early in how he talked about it. There's, I'd say this, for Kaplan very much, since religion is about achieving salvation and salvation is defined by the community for Kaplan as it exists today, there are ways in which Kaplan's thinking leads to both a lot of religious creativity and practice and also innovation and change. It's why, in some ways, in terms of ritual and practice, the Reconstructionist movement is more innovative and progressive than the conservative movement, rooted in Heschel. And there were those who felt Heschel's ideas took people to move too fast from tradition and traditional observance, which was both a valued and necessary piece of Jewish life, especially in an open, free society like America. There were those that celebrated the innovation that came out of Kaplan's writings, and those that I think feared the way in which following Kaplan could lead one to give up things that we've held on to for a long time. And I think that in some ways in the 20th century, a slogan of conservative movement was tradition and change. And that was internal questioning within the conservative movement. And in some ways, Kaplan was very much rooted in that debate. Okay, Michael, we have a lot of chatting questions, which is okay. I appreciate that. It leaves you just as listeners just to my voice alone and not others, but I'm happy for that. Michael asks in I think the very first text, or going back, Kaplan talks about both God, and he also said God's plural, and asks, does Kaplan allow for multiple gods? I think when Kaplan says gods here, what Kaplan means is different religions, different communities find different language to describe and define God. So Kaplan would talk about, right, the Jewish God and the Christian God, and together might refer to them as gods. I don't think that means he's a polytheist as opposed to a monotheist, but it means that he's aware that different religions, different religious groups at different times, each have their own way of defining God and salvation. And because of that, that leads to his plural expression of that. And what he's definitely a pluralist to say there's not a battle between religions. We don't have to determine, right, is Christianity or Hinduism or Judaism right? But he would say that each civilization has their own religion as part of their civilization, and each presents their own understanding of salvation and then their own understanding of God, and that's where the S goes at the end to describe the plural gods. Okay, we're running down to the last 3 minutes. If you have a burning question that you'd like to get in before we wrap up, this is a time to chat it or to signify that you want to speak by raising your hand. So we have a question. I heard and read what Kaplan said about God regarding reason, but I didn't comprehend it in time because I could not reread it since it came off the screen. So we can repost the link so you can download these texts if you want, but I'll answer your question. Does Kaplan fully believe that God does or does not oppose reason and science? So I would say this: Kaplan doesn't believe in God. That's an entity. So Kaplan wouldn't describe any verb or any action necessarily to God. But Kaplan definitely thinks that both reason and science are part of human civilization. What he says is, right, reason is something that we use to experience the world, but we will not come to define God or believe in God through reason. It's the experience of God and our pull towards salvation that leads us to God. So reason, rationality, logic are not the route to finding God, and we can't and shouldn't use those tools to try to convince someone to believe in God. So it's not a statement against reason or against science. I think Kaplan on the science end would say that science gives us a lot of tools that helps with the advance of our civilization, but science doesn't provide the structure for us to think about how to use science towards achieving salvation. That is the role of religion, to help shape us to how to use the tools of science that we create to make sure we use them for good and not for evil, to say that in a simple way, or for salvation and not against salvation. So Carolyn asked, did Kaplan believe that the Torah was given to Israel at Sinai by God through Moshe? And Kaplan's clear answer to that would be no. Kaplan does not believe in supernatural revelation and does not believe that the Torah as a document comes from God. The statements he made about that definitely got him into trouble with people who firmly were in that camp and believed that strongly. And there's more to dig into based on that question. So I want to thank everybody for their questions. I want to say it's from my seat, it does not do justice to any of these thinkers to try to look at them in 45 minutes. Mordechai Kaplan wrote a lot, as did Heschel. I tried to find paragraphs that would give you a sense of where he's starting from. I would say The Future of the American Jew, which he wrote in 1967, is a great place to start if you want to read more. His epic work is Judaism as a Civilization, which he wrote, I think 1917, I want to say is the public. It's early 20th century. Much of Kaplan's thinking is laid out in Judaism as a Civilization, but I would say is, as he aged, he was able to explain his theories more clearly and in fewer words. So his later books, I would say, are often better places to start. But if you want to go to the source, Judaism as a Civilization is a place to read, but you need some good coffee to get through that. Or maybe it's good to read before bed if you want to drift off into slumber with Kaplan on your mind. I really appreciate the questions that you asked through chat. You asked some really good questions. I hope in answering them, I help provide a little more context and understandings of what Kaplan is about. And I hope last week and this week you got enough of a taste of both Heschel and Kaplan that you feel you're starting to see some directions of 20th century Jewish thought. Next week, we're going to look at Harold Kushner, who of the people that will be the first pulpit rabbi that we're going to read. He also has some interesting things to say, and we'll do this again. And I appreciate you being here with me. Thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to more in the future. And I hope between now and then we all find new ways to help achieve salvation from the obstacles we are currently confronting. There are some both biological and sociological that are very much on the front page of all the news, and it's a serious time to think about all of that stuff as well. But I appreciate you taking some time out to look at some theology, which I hope can be a resource to you also.